Competency lost from sin. Good day. The competency of individual in spiritual matter is an important belief to the Baptist. This distinctive affects everything about a believer's faith and action. Did you know that the word competency is defined as sufficiency of means of living, ability to do tasks, or sufficiency of means for the necessities and conveniences of life? The quality or state of being competent, or in other words, having the required ability or qualities. Lost through sin. Man was created by the special act of God. Why? Because God created man in His own image, and His crowning work of His creation. In the beginning, man was innocent of sin and was endowed by God with freedom of choice. And by his free choice, man sinned against God and brought sin into the human race. Through the temptation of Satan, of course. Man transgressed the command of God and fell from the original innocence. Therefore, all men inherit the nature and the environment inclined towards sin. As soon as they are capable of moral action, they become transgressors and are under the condemnation of God. Only the grace of God can bring man into His holy fellowship and enable man to fulfill the creative purpose of God. The value of man is evident in that God originally created man in His own image, and in that Christ died for man. Therefore, every man possesses dignity and is worthy of respect and Christian love. So while God made man in His own image, God also gave man the authority and the natural relationship with Him. Man chose to surrender his competency in these areas for temporary and less worthwhile things. When sin came into the world through the choice and disobedience of man, the result of sin was death, and it was spread to all men because all men followed the tendency to sin. So, man is not a sinner because Adam disobeyed God or committed rebellion against Him. Man is a sinner because he inherited the tendency to a particular kind of thought or action towards evil. Meaning, every area of man's personality has been affected by this tendency. However, this does not mean that every man is as bad as he can be, or that every man is as bad as every other man. The New Testament. The usage of the word sin is more explicit than just missing the mark or target. It is used to signify, first, the principle or source of action or an inward control which produces acts. Second, the controlling principle or organizing power which acts through the members of the body by controlling the will of a person. First, let's talk about the will. Will as the seat of sin. It organizes the personality until sin becomes the reigning force in a life. Sin is an act of the will. It is the result of the wrong use of the moral freedom God gave to mankind. Man's will is to choose to rebel against the wishes of God and turn from that will and follow his own desires. The individual can even know to do right and yet still choose to do its own will. The will brings about all kinds of sin. One becomes a slave, a captive to desire to sin. And then sin becomes a principle which when obeyed produces undesirable but predictable result. The Old Testament. You know, the word for evil is ra'ah, which means calamity, harm, hurt, and distress. Sin produces nothing but bad. One's conscience becomes controlled to prefer evil over good. One becomes hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. one is unable to resist doing sin. And then the result of the inward working of sin is death. Though this does not mean that the result of sin are the worst or the most evident wrongdoings. It means that doing evil is the first nature of man. You know, in the Bible, unbelief is the greatest of all sins. This is not only a lack of trust, but a deliberate rejection of the will of God. One cannot see unbelief, but it is evident in the action. It can be seen through your actions. The original sin was the effort of the will to enthrone self and have one's own way. Like, for example, this is my life. Buhay ko to concept. This has become less than what God intended for man to be. Man was God's highest achievement, and He declared His creation to be very good. But this soon changed. In Genesis 6:5 says, "The Lord saw how great man's wickedness on earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil at all times." The origin of sin. You know, the Bible does not really tell too much about the origin of sin, but let me give you some glimpse of it. First, it was and is a temptation from the evil one. Next, man's desire to rule his own life takes precedence over doing the will of God. Man follows the will of evil. This is my life. I decide what I want to do. You only live once mindset. Next is, it is man's choice to do evil. As Proverbs 1:29-30 says. The will controlled by fleshly desires produces the worst sins. Next, every man is prone to follow his own will, which leads him to commit sinful acts. So all have become sinners. Romans 3:23. Man, as a free moral and intelligent being, has the power to choose his own way. He chooses to rebel against God and disobey Him. This is sin. Consequences of sin. So what are the consequences of doing sin? You know, when a man chooses to sin, he determines his destiny already. As the scriptures declares, the soul that sinneth shall die. That's why Jesus explained that death was not to be extinguished or to cease to be, as Paul is illustrated it as being dead while living. Death is the ultimate consequence of one's own desire. As Proverbs 11:19 says, "He that pursueth evil, pursueth it to his own death." You know, there's 3 ways to signify separation as the consequence of man's sin. So first is the physical death. God created man to live forever at first. The tree of life was to be his food. But when man chose to disobey God and rebel against his will, he became subject to separation of the soul. All mankind is born with a sinful nature. Next is separation from God. As undesirable as physical death may be to people, being separated from God in life and after death is an even more severe separation. Man became separated from God by choice. Adam walked and talked with God until he chose not to do so. Man's desire to be separated from God forced God to separate himself from man. God hid his face from the sinner and withdrew from men. But being separated from all that God can provide for man does not mean that God is ignorant of the intent and action of sin. Third is the second death. The second death is hell. This is the final separation from God and all that is good. This is eternal separation of the spirit and soul from God. The soul will continue to exist eternally with no hope of ever being reunited with God. Competency regained through Christ. God can restore man to his competency to relate to Him and to spiritual matters only through all sufficiency of Christ. For in Him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through Him to reconcile to Himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of His cross. For in Him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily, and you have come to fullness of life in Him, who is the head of all rules and authority. As Baptists, we maintain this belief about Christ. Baptists believe that Christ was, is, and evermore shall be the absolute God. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in Him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions, or principalities or authorities. All things were created through Him and for Him. Baptists also believe that only through Christ can man have restored the competency to relate to God. Only when Christ settled down in the heart of the believers does He give the power to comprehend, know, and be filled with the fullness of life in Him, who is the head of all rules and authority. That's why man's choice of sin left him incomplete, and only through the union with Christ can man be restored, so he is complete. Christ alone can restore man to what he has lost through sin. Christ always has the ear of God where He makes intercession for man. Competency lost from sin. This is my report. Have a good day.